Martin Luther King Jr., the man behind the dream.
In the 1950s, there were many movements shaping this time period into an influential decade for America. One of the most prominent movements that were present during the 1950s was the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 1950s for African Americans to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. Although the Civil War had officially abolished slavery, it didn't end discrimination against African Americans, as they continued to endure the devastating effects of racism, especially in the South. By the mid-20th century, African Americans had more than enough prejudice and violence against them. They, along with many whites, began an unprecedented fight for equality that spanned 2 decades. This movement had its root in the centuries-long efforts of African slaves resisting racial oppression and abolishing the institution of slavery. Although American slaves were emancipated as a result of the Civil War and were then granted basic civil rights through the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, struggles for federal protection of these rights continued during the next century. Through nonviolent protests, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s broke the pattern of public facilities being segregated by race in the South and achieved the most important breakthrough in the equal rights legislation for African Americans since the Reconstruction period. Many people contributed to this movement, like Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He entered a public school when he was 5 years old and skipped the 9th and 11th grade at Booker T. Washington High School. At age 15, he entered Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, where he earned a degree in sociology. After being accepted to several colleges for his doctoral study, including Yale and Edinburgh in Scotland, King enrolled at Boston University. In 1954, while working on his dissertation, King became a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama. He completed his PhD and earned his degree in 1955. King, at this time, was only 25 years old.
On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, secretary of the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery bus and was arrested. Activists coordinated a bus boycott that would continue for 381 days, placing a severe economic strain on the public transit system and downtown business owners. They chose Martin Luther King Jr. as a protest leader and official spokesman. By the time the Supreme Court ruled segregated seating on public buses unconstitutional in November of 1956, King had entered the national spotlight as an inspirational figure of organized, nonviolent resistance. After the boycott's success, MLK founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, along with other civil rights activists, a group committed to achieving full equality for African Americans through nonviolent protest. Their motto was, "Not one hair of one head of one person should be harmed." As president, MLK traveled across the country and around the world, giving lectures on nonviolent protests and civil rights, as well as meeting with the religious figures, activists, and political leaders. When visiting India in 1959, he had the opportunity to meet with family members and followers of Gandhi, a man he described as the guiding light of our technique of nonviolent social change. In 1960, MLK moved to Atlanta, where he joined his father as co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, but that did not stop him from participating in major civil rights battles in the 1960s. During the Birmingham campaign of 1963, in which activists used boycotts, sit-ins, and marches to protest segregation and unfair hiring practices, MLK was arrested for his involvement, and while in custody, he wrote his manifesto that became known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, addressed to a group of white clergymen who criticized his nonviolent tactics.
The March on Washington was a massive protest that occurred in August 1963 when 250,000 people, made up of both blacks and whites, gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. and marched for both jobs and freedom. Inspiration for the march came from the violent attacks on civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. A. Philip Randolph, another civil rights advocate, planned his march for the purpose of gaining equal opportunities for jobs, while Martin Luther King planned his march for the purpose of equality and freedom. The two decided to merge their movements together and march for both goals. President John F. Kennedy met with both civil rights leaders before the march and stated that he feared the event would end in violence and that maybe it was not the right time for the movement. Randolph, King, and other leaders insisted the march should go forward, which eventually ended up in John F. Kennedy reluctantly endorsing the march. Many famous personalities attended the march, which ended in success. It was at this march where Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which he is known for today. Many people in the crowd rallied in support for this speech and supported his view on an equal world in the future. All did not end well, however, for Martin Luther King, as he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. His assassination sent shockwaves around the world and caused an outpouring of anger among Black Africans, as well as a period of national mourning that helped pave the way for an equal housing bill that would be the last significant legislative achievement of the civil rights movement. In the later years of his life, Martin Luther King began to be a victim of mounting criticism from many young Black Americans who supported a more confrontational approach that was provided to them by another civil rights leader named Malcolm X. Malcolm sought out to continue to advocate for peaceful protests and was called to Memphis, Tennessee to give a speech at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis. Just after 6 p.m. the following day, King was standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel where he and his associates were staying when a sniper's bullet struck him in the neck. He was rushed to a hospital where he was pronounced dead about an hour later at the age of 39. King's death marked the end of a critical character throughout the civil rights movement and eventually paved the way for the legislative bills that gave equal rights to African Americans.